noch ein bisschen dämpfen, weil ich
kann noch mal was verändern, oder? Ja, ich habe gerade nochmal alle möglichen Sachen rausgedreht, aber auch vielleicht. Very quickly. They're already on, just not on the one on the computer. But as soon as they start to
Thank you for coming. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to this interesting session. The audience is a bit thin still, not too many people, but perhaps others will arrive. This is the first research meeting of this year, and this year is a special year because it's the first time that we do not have a pre-summit research day, but we have research meetings during the summit, which is very interesting because this allows us to have interaction between researchers and policymakers, which I think is very important. Good morning, Steve. Before we start, let me first run through some official issues. The presentation this year is done in cooperation between at least 5 organizations. This is the European Commission, ECTRI, ITF, of course, the Transportation Research Board, and the WCTRS. I'm afraid I had to look that up, but it is the World Conference on Transport Research Society. So we have a very strong cooperation here. And our American friends just arrived, which is great because they're always great fans of having interaction between policymaking and research. Welcome to you, gentlemen. I would like to start with by mentioning that there is a connection. I'm going outside the light because I'm looking at the light all the time. I'm sorry about that. We have later tomorrow, tomorrow morning at 9, there will be another session that is also related to the same subject, accessibility. And I would like all of you to consider the option of going there and listen to the panel there. And because, I'll also have a small role. The Netherlands is going to tell something about how accessibility influences policymaking. And I think it's also a very interesting session. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Let me start by telling you in a very short lines. Where is my clicker? Over there. Okay, sorry. Something about what we did in the Netherlands on equity, which is done. It was done on a request of our Director General, who thought that equity is really an important issue in traffic and transport for specific reasons. So he asked us, can you find out for us what are the most important issues when it comes to equity in traffic and transport? And before I come to the main different ways to look at equity, I would like to show you what the difference is between equity and equality. Perhaps many of you know, and especially when you see this slide, you will immediately understand, but of course, people are not equal. There are poor people and rich people, people who are highly educated and are people who work with their hands, and they're all equally important, they're all equally valuable, but they do not have the same opportunities. So the question is, to what extent do you want to adjust your policy to the differences in opportunities that people have? And if you do nothing, well, then people who are worse off will not see the game, will not enjoy the game. And of course, what you can do is help people who are worse off by, well, you can see the slide, and well, of course, it is the most friendly and perhaps fair way to do this is to make sure that these differences between people do not show any longer, do not influence their capability of taking part in society. That's one thing. The other important thing that I want to share with you is the 3, in our view, most important different ways to apply equity to society, or in our case, to traffic and transport. And that is utilitarianism, difficult words to pronounce, especially when you have a dry mouth, utilitarianism, egalitarianism, and sufficientarianism. And I'll give a short explanation of the three differences. Utilitarianism, you probably all know what that is. It means you maximize or optimize the total gain in a project or when choosing between projects. And in that way, you maximize the chances and the gain for the whole society. And either directly or indirectly, this is in favor of the whole society. But there's a drawback, and the drawback is there may be people within the society that are really not happy with that. There can be people, there can be enormous differences. If you want to minimize the differences, usually that goes at the cost of maximum utility, but then you will strive for egalitarianism. And there's a third one in between. No, the third one is not in between, it's on the right. And that is that you decide that you want every member of society to enjoy a minimum quality of whatever you have in mind. For example, you don't want people to suffer from serious noise from airports or roads, and you require from everyone who makes noise that there is a maximum level of noise that cannot be exceeded for everyone who is living in the neighborhood of an airport. And these three different ways of applying equity make it more difficult for policymakers. When we presented this at the board of our department, then some of the director generals really sighed and said, well, Henk, this is going to make our work even more difficult. And that's true, of course. But then again, this is what is going on in society. If you want to take care of these differences, if you want to solve them, you'll have to look at the effect of your policy to the levels of for example, sound or accessibility for all. So this as a start for the meeting for today. You will see that the different speakers will address different types of equity, which is all fine, of course, because they all exist, and they're all being in use. And it's up to you to think and think what questions you will ask the researchers afterward. We have a fine set of researchers. I'll go through them very briefly. We have Greg Erhardt. He's over there. He will speak third today. Where do I have my notes on him? Because I would like to say something about him. Over here. Greg is from Kentucky. He is associate professor. He has 20 years of experience in transportation engineering, and he's quite a guy. He was named. It says here he was named a rising star by the Transportation Research Board, which is well, you have to meet those expectancies because. But I think you can. I think your presentation will be very interesting. And then we have Dr. Deepti Jain, who is over there. She is assistant professor in transportation research and injury prevention in the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi. And she is an architect and a planner. And when I read your short CV, I saw that you were really interested in zipping policy making and research. Especially, you already started that with your PhD work, developing comprehensive mobility planning guidelines for medium-sized Indian cities. And it was adopted by the Ministry of Urban Development in 2014. It makes me very happy to see that policymakers adopt research results. And well, there's more to say, but I'll leave it to that. Then we have George Yannis. George is over there. He's from Greece. I know George for a long time. He's a marathon walker. He walks all over the world, and he's a very lean and fast guy. And also very good in his profession. He's he published many papers, and he is George is a cooperator. When you have an international project and you're joining the first meeting, it's very likely you will meet George there because he is always in those meetings. And George is a road safety expert, but not just road safety. It's all kinds of subjects. I'm very much looking forward to all of these three presentations. And the final presenter that I would like to introduce to you is Tony. And Tony will introduce herself. Please, Tony, will you take the floor? You can stand, you can take a mic if you want. You can stand over there, but it's you can just as well use this mic. I think it's just more, and then you can walk around. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Tony.
Turn it on.
It's on, just put it
Oh, hello, good morning everyone.
Would you,
I'm Tony
shall I
Jimomi. I work with GIZ India, and I work primarily on electric vehicle and charging infrastructure. So there we work a lot on technical recommendations that need to come about to integrate EVs to the grid, and also on battery recycling and reuse. I'm actually here presenting on behalf of a colleague actually who couldn't make it. So yeah, it's nice to see all of you. Looking forward to the presentation and the discussion.
yeah, but thank you. But you can continue because you will be the first speaker. So you could just not? Yes? On my list, it says she is the first speaker. Will you go and stand over there?
Major apologies, that was certainly my bad.
Okay. But if I'm mistaken, it's also, that's also a possibility.
No,
you
of
see.
course.
Yeah. Good luck.
So hello and good morning everyone. I'm Tony Jimomi, and this research work has actually been conducted by my colleague Avni Mehta and Dr. Rutul Joshi. Because of visa issues, they couldn't make it here, so I'm here presenting on their behalf. The research work is on transport disadvantage and the impact it has on the low-income group, and obviously with a specific context on Indian context in the city of Gurgaon. So this is a this is an image of Delhi, as you see. It's very crowded, but well, only 14% of the households have an access to motorized vehicle, as per the census of 2011. And the current situation is such that India is a growing economy, and there is much infrastructure development yet to be done. And the public money is spent, but there is no accountability as to how the money is spent. And obviously that relates, what happens is that unfortunately the poor bears the consequences of these unaccountabilities. And so past literature on urban poor have focused on travel behavior, but no one has ever really questioned the consequences these transport behaviors have had on the poor. And hence the need to understand the compromises people have to make because of transport disadvantage and the impact it has on their life. So as per Karen Lucas, this is she came up with this concept where transport disadvantage, when combined with social disadvantage, results to transport poverty, which further leads to inaccessibility to key life opportunities, which further leads to the social inclusion of the person, of the group of people. So the author here has used this framework to frame her research questions. So these are some of the transport disadvantage from across the world as per the literature review, and we see that in a lot of the global north, the the first transport disadvantage would be the lack of access to private cars, and the second would come to access to public transport. So the work here has identified 3 types of transport poverty: transport mobility poverty, accessibility poverty, and transport affordability. So yeah, as mentioned, as per the Karen Lucas's work, the author here has looked at what are the types of transport disadvantage specifically to the Indian context, the types of social disadvantage, and does that lead to inaccessibility? And we will look at that further. So this is Gurgaon. Gurgaon neighbors Delhi. So Gurgaon comes under the National Capital Region, and it has a population of 1.5 million as per the 2011 census. We have not had a census since, and the new census will come about in October of this year. Yeah, so this was Gurgaon in 1991, and in 2022, this is how it looks. So Guru Rani, who is a researcher, stated that this city is an exercise in flexible planning, and that accommodated the desires of the wealthy and political elites. But we also have, and these are a few of the other stock images of Gurgaon. So we also have to look into consider the desires and wants of the urban poor. So this is one of the images of where the surroundings of where the urban villages are. So the 2 site locations which the author has considered is Sikandarpur and Islampur. So as this is a site location, and Sikandarpur is very close to the metro line. It is in a central location, though both are urban villages. So Sikandarpur has access to metro, has an access to a road, and it also has an access to both formal and informal modes of transport, whereas Islampur is very far and only has access to the informal mode of transport. So this is Sikandarpur, and this is Islampur. As you see, that is very densely populated, and there is no regulations with regards to the building bylaws, and yeah. So this is the socio-economic makeup of both of these places, and we see that the average household income of both of these places is about 10 to 20,000 per month, rupees per month, which would translate about 100 euros per month. And the primary occupation of these places would be regularly waged salary employees and domestic workers and students looking for jobs. Yeah. So the research findings here, the summary of the travel behavior states that 85% of the people opt for non-motorized transport, 98% of the trips are work or education related, and 75% travel less than 2.5 kilometers, and also less than 30 minutes. And a lot of, you see the huge 0.3% people spend 0 rupees on their travel or lack of travel. So according to the findings, the author states that these are the parameters with regards to the places that she has looked at. So for the mobility disadvantage, she has mentioned that it would be the lack of adequate public transport, also the lack of vehicle ownership, overcrowding of the public transport. Even if there is, it's too overcrowded, which sort of makes the people not want to take that form of transport, and also rash driving, which I will come to later, and transport affordability. Since in the specific city of Gurgaon that we're talking about, it's not regulated, the fares are not regulated, so the fare rests on the people who run the transport, so they can really hike up the price, which really dissuades people from taking up the sort of transport, and hence it decreases their access to opportunities. And accessibility is that unsafe pedestrian pathways and intersections, which we'll also see later. So yeah, this is one, and these are the interviews which the author has had with a lot of the people working there. So this is Rajiv, who is a 20-year-old employee, and he says that with regards to inadequate public transport, he says that there is buses to go, but because it's uncertain as to the bus timings, and also he has to wait for very long, which obviously relates to being late for his work. So he ends up taking bus on few days, even if there's inadequate. So, and he takes up taking the chakra. Chakra is sort of shared auto, so he ends up taking that. And similarly, you see that in overcrowding in the Chakra, the shared autos and public bus services, there's Priya, 19-year-old woman, college-going student, says that though she has the access, since because it's very overcrowded and there's a lot of men and it's very tightly, very packed, she feels unsafe and also uncomfortable. So she ends up taking up metro, which is a little more expensive than the buses, and which also takes a bit longer because then you have routes. But then it's more safe for her, and that's how her behavior pattern changes because of these influences. And on rash driving by shared auto and e-rickshaws, so this is an interview with Shanti. So what she says is that because she has no other choice, so for the Chakra, for the auto drivers, their primary concern is to make maximum number of trips, and also to have maximum number of people in the auto, because the more it's charged per person, so you have a maximum number of trips, maximum number of people, the shortest route possible, and they don't follow the rules. So they just go about, and then it's very rash driving for them. And the people who use them, they feel unsafe, but as the person here mentions, that he has no choice, and he has accepted that as a way it is, and he has to accommodate his travel pattern according to that. And on the affordability aspect, so as I mentioned earlier, it's not regulated. So this was earlier, it's 3 years back, 50 rupees, but then now it's 100 and 150, which is beyond the paying capacity of the people who live there. So these are some of the interviews of Madhumita, who says that she would like to take her kids out and go to places, but then she's restricted because of the prices that they have to pay, and many more of such instances, and such interviews. So we see that the trip lengths we see that what should be for 1 kilometer, what should be a very short distance, 30 people, almost 30% take about 10 to 30 minutes. And why this is because of this type of intersections. There are no proper intersections in between. So what they have to do is that they have to go, what could have been just a short crossover, they have to really go to the end of it. So in order to avoid that, they end up crossing over this, which, as you can guess, is very risky. So, but they take up taking the risk daily to cross over the bridge and the intersection and run past the road. So so this is the daily lived experiences of the people living there. So these are the interviews that we've had, and she says that it usually just takes about 15 minutes to get to the mall, but then she has to really look at that, so she ends up taking up the longer route. So the summary of the findings is that the people refrain from making travel choices that will entail spending on motorized transit because of the income aspect, and also people have access to their daily needs. They can survive in the city, but access to better opportunities and certain desires is restricted, as mentioned earlier, because their radius of opportunity is less than 2.5 kilometers. And so in villages, especially in terms of education and recreational purposes, and they also make this decision to take job offers within the locality, within the travel pattern that they can take, so which restricts a lot of job opportunities for them. And there's a restricted mobility for both male and female in both the villages that we have considered. And the people are highly vulnerable to road accidents due to lack of safe pedestrian pathways and rash driving by motorized modes. So the recommendations that have come about, the author suggests, is that for any new infrastructure development that should come about, you should focus on enhancing the mobility of people, and of course to promote more sustainable form of mode of transport, and it has to be affordable. And also, what the author suggests is that the actions that can be taken out by the city, the responsible stakeholders in the city, is that there have to be safe pedestrian pathways and road crossings, promote cycling, especially for women, so as to increase their mobility, and also promote public bike sharing systems, regularization of the informal transport to make it more safe, and also better quality of public transport. So the way forward, the author mentions, is about the assessment of understanding of more disadvantaged groups, to factor that in, needs to be undertaken, and the need for more urban mobility policies at local level, which focuses on inclusive planning and development. And importantly, the author suggests the sensitization and capacity building of government offices towards people-friendly transport infrastructure, because it is at the end that they are the ones who are looking at the different planning and implementation of it, so there has to be more of sensitization. Yeah, so that would conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony. Yes, sufficient issues over there. Safety issues, non-motorized vehicle possession issues, which perhaps in the far future is not so much a problem, because, well, we also have, I looked up, yesterday when I was preparing this meeting, I looked up where New Delhi and your city, and it was, at that moment, it was 42 degrees centigrade. There are really climate issues also. So the question, of course, is how to solve those issues and at the same time improve accessibility. We can't all have cars, but not only because of the money, but also because of climate. But then we do need this traffic and transport accessibility. Thank you very much. The next presentation will be by Deepti. Please, Deepti, take the floor. Deepti will also tell you something about another city in India. You may wonder why so many cities in India in this meeting, but remember there are more people in India than there are in Europe and America together. So I think it's more than reasonable that we have India presented here.
Thank you, Hank. So today I'm going to discuss about walk-to-work accessibility as a score towards determining policy interventions. I am Deepti Jain, Assistant Professor at Transportation Research and Injury Prevention Center. We work a lot with government authorities towards determining research-led policies. So this is, before we start understanding walk-to-work accessibility score, let's first understand what the city looks like. City of Visakhapatnam is basically a port and industrial town, which is situated on the western coast of India, with a population size of 2 million and population density of more than 3,000 persons per square kilometers. That's a lot. So the map over here actually shows the distribution pattern of the activities. Activities here, I mean population as well as the activities in space, for example, commercial, the jobs, the schools, institutional, and others. So how this distribution is like, so what we see in there is a point over there, if you can note, that's the city core. And as we are moving away from the city core, which is also reflected in this graph over here, the density decreases. The development of the Visakhapatnam is mostly around the arterial roads, that is providing the regional connectivity. And most of this development is not only because of the kind of transport infrastructure that is there, but also because of the terrain that is there. So on the, there is a coast on the other side, and there is a hilly terrain on the either side. So that's how the Visakhapatnam looks like. In terms of the travel patterns, the green bars are actually the sustainable modes of transport, and the orange bars are the non-sustainable modes of transport. So we can see over here, majority of the population is either walking or using public transport in the city. And with respect to the vehicles usage, it is the motorized two-wheelers. But having said that, if we start comparing what is happening with respect to the different income groups, then the low income group is the one who is more dependent on walking, whereas the high income group is essentially using cars. Not only there is a difference in the mobility choices, but also there is a reflected difference in terms of the trip lengths. And we can see that maybe it may be determined by the mode choices, but the low income group is walking or is accessing destination which is available in the shorter distance. Whereas the higher income group is having access to the opportunities which is placed at a distant location. Now, when we start comparing how different groups of people spend their time in travel by different modes of transport. So a bus user is essentially spending on an average 60 minutes, that is 1 hour, to reach their destinations. But when we compare it with a personal vehicle user, then we see that there is a lot of difference because they spend only 25 minutes. So this brings an important understanding towards understanding the differences in the accessibility, because it's not only about the opportunities, but also the time spent by different modes of transport. So what we observe is that there is a lot of people who are dependent on non-motorized transport. However, the infrastructure is non-supportive of the demand, because only 7% of the roads are actually having footpaths. Also, the city is observing growth in terms of spatial expansion. So having looked at 3 different master plans of the city, in all of these 3 master plans are talking about expanding the core city areas towards the peripheries to accommodate the growing demand. It's only recently the master plan is talking about bringing the re-densification of the city core areas and providing better physical and social infrastructure. So there are many things that are happening in the cities. There is a master plan. Some kind of public transport development is also going on. But eventually the crashes on the roads are on rise, and also the problems of congestion, other than accessibility related issues. So now I'll come to main part of my research, which is talking about how the accessibility varies with respect to the income group, how accessibility varies with respect to the modes, and whether the development pattern is determining the choice for walking or not. So for this, we measure accessibility by 2 methods. One is, okay, don't look into the equations, but basically we are looking at the intermodal ratio of accessibility. I'll take a bit to explain that. It's basically the number of opportunities that are accessible by, for example, public transport in a given threshold to the total number of opportunities that could have been accessed by a private vehicle within the same travel time threshold. And for the travel time threshold, we take the average travel time that the people are traveling for by different modes. So coming to the results of it, now if a bus user uses the bus for 60 minutes, as we had observed, and for the same travel time is spent on cars, then a bus user accesses only 40% of the opportunities, job opportunities that are accessible by the car. Whereas we cannot obviously compare what is happening or how do the walk mode and car modes compare. But if a bus user uses a bus for 25 minutes, which is an average travel time spent by a car user, then they are accessing only 10% of the total opportunities. So there is a lot of disparity in terms of what kind of mode you're using and how many opportunities you can access within the same travel time thresholds. Second measure of accessibility is basically walk-to-work accessibility, and here we account for the competition. So imagine there is a zone A which can be accessed within 15 minutes walking distance. Now why 15 minutes? Because we are very much fancied about 15-minute cities. So considering that it is an acceptable walkable distance, so we want to understand how this accessibility, which can encourage walking in the cities, is observed in the city. So we can see over here, for example, an A zone has access to B and C zone. So the population living in A zone has total number of opportunities that are available in A, B, and C zone. Now imagine that B and C zone are accessible within 15 minutes walking distance by D and E zone respectively. So the total competition with respect to the B zone would be all the demand that is there at A, B, C, and D zone. Similarly, we can estimate what is the total competition for the C zone. So the second accessibility measure is the ratio of the total number of opportunities available by each of the zones, traffic analysis zones in this case, to the total number of demand that is going to be there accounting for the competition. And to estimate that demand, we consider the union function for all the opportunities or all the origin demands that are accessible. Now coming to the results, this map shows the walk-to-work accessibility score, and like what we could observe for travel activity density, this is very different because there is no specific spatial pattern Because even if you look at the periphery part of the city, there also we see that walk-to-work accessibility score is still higher. However, the average walk-to-work accessibility score is only 0.36. What does this score mean? So if you have a value greater than 1, that means more than one opportunities are accessible by the population living in that area, and that is accounting for the competition. And if it is less than 1, then you have lesser number of opportunities accessible than the demand. Now, does this score varies with respect to the income group? The graph over here says no. There is no difference with respect to the income groups. That means the society, the city development of the city of Visakhapatnam is uniform. There is no social exclusion by the way the city has developed. Now, coming to how does it has an impact on walk choice, we can see that it is a significant variable. Walk accessibility score is a significant variable in terms of determining walk choice. However, if we look at the dominance ratio, it is the income and gender that determines the choice for walking more than the development pattern. The reasons could be many. One is because I have access to the vehicle, so why would I put myself on risk? I can access more number of opportunities while I use a vehicle. It gives me better flexibilities, more safety. It may be also related to the walkable infrastructure, whether it is present or not. Like the earlier speaker had also shown for the city of Gurgaon, how the systems are not so accessible by walking, or how the systems are not so walkable. But we had not been able to measure walkability score for the city. So this brings me to certain policy-led conclusions. One is with respect to the city planning. As we had observed that an average walk-to-work accessibility score is only 0.36, which is very low. So therefore, there is a need for not only densification, but diversification, so that opportunities and demand are balanced. With respect to the transport, we can draw two conclusions. One is that there is a need for investment in public transport system. As we had already observed that the number of opportunities that are accessible by the public transport system is very less. So the two modes, the personal motorized vehicles and the public transport, are not actually comparable. So, and also earlier research had shown that only 44% of the total users are having access to public transport within 500 meters walking distance. Therefore, not only there is a need for route expansion so that more people can be accessed by the public transport system, but also there is a need to work on the routing, the operational characteristics of the public transport system, so that the frequencies can be increased, the waiting time can be reduced, and that will have a lot of impact in terms of service quality. Second, with respect to the walkable infrastructure, these are the images taken from Google Streets, and you can see whether we are talking about the outer peripheries or within the city, there is no separate walkable infrastructure, and the crossings are also not available. Although we have not been able to measure the walkability score, but we can say that from the results that the income is determining more the walking choice, right? So if we have better walkable infrastructure, then we can encourage higher income group to actually walk for shorter distances. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Deepti. Interesting presentation. And the question that comes to mind that we will discuss later is what would be the best solution, public transport or both, of course, but what should you do first? Something to think about. The next presentation will be Greg. Greg, you have the floor. Greg will talk about the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet and their questions regarding 1,200 proposed projects. And they requested that the Kentucky University scored these measures and made recommendations for improvement. And I think it's a very nice example of a close interaction between policymaking and research. Greg, you have the floor.
Excellent. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to our first two speakers. I want to acknowledge our partners at the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet who worked side by side with us on this research, and to the Institute for Advanced Study at TU Munich, who are enabling me to be here today. The problem. So in Kentucky, the state legislature, it's one of the few states in the US where the state legislature has the direct authority to pick transportation projects. That's historically been done through a political process, but about 8 years ago, the Transportation Cabinet implemented what they call SHIFT. Now, SHIFT is a data-driven approach that seeks to score those projects, develop a ranking score, to advise the legislature on what the most promising projects would be to build. And it's done based on these 5 categories. Each of those categories has a set of metrics that's used to produce those scores, and then they're combined into an overall score. I'm going to focus today on the economic growth metric. To give a little bit of context, Kentucky is a state of about 4.5 million people in the center of the map there. The sort of western and northern part of the state in gray, there's some urban areas. It's doing relatively well economically. It's a good center for logistics. There's some investment in battery manufacturing, for example. The eastern part of the state is in the Appalachian Mountains. It's a historic coal mining region, and it's home to some very persistent and longstanding poverty. Now, this is of obvious concern to the policymakers, and they are interested in the ability of transportation projects and investments to help mitigate some of that poverty and help improve economic conditions in those situations. And this has been reflected in the SHIFT scoring. The way it's been reflected initially is to give extra points, if you will, to projects built in disadvantaged regions. However, in talking to cabinet staff, they're saying, look, we're building these projects in these areas, but we don't see an improvement. We're not able to observe that. Are we doing the right thing? Is this effective? So this is the context that we're starting out here. And so the Transportation Cabinet came to the university and they said, hey, we want to engage. We want you to look over how we're doing these scoring and provide some recommendations. And so our objectives here are actually 3 things, and they go together. First, we want to understand what types of projects are effective at improving economic outcomes. Second, to reflect that in this scoring process. And then third, it's really important that the staff be able to explain and defend the results. They wanted something that was not a black box, if you will. And so in doing that, and in going through this process, it's about 1,200 projects every 2-year cycle that need to get ranked from across the state, primarily road projects here. And so we need to be consistent, is the whole point, across a fairly diverse range of projects. So the solution. I'm going to walk through in 4 steps how we implemented this in a practical way, and what some of the implications are, because there's a few details that actually matter and that I think affect the scores with implications for what gets built and what doesn't get built. So first, we leaned into the notion of accessibility here. So we're measuring how many jobs you can get to within a certain commuting distance. Typically, you see this measured and expressed as jobs within 60 minutes, jobs within 30 minutes. We're actually using, instead of a sort of fixed breakpoint, a continuous curve, so you don't get going from 61 minutes to 59 minutes, the big jump. When you apply this, something known as effective density, you get a ranking that looks like the map in green there, and what you see is that the low accessibility regions are also the poorer regions of the state, and the parts in the green are actually doing fairly well. Louisville in the Cincinnati area, and down towards Nashville, Tennessee. But our interest here is not just in what the absolute is, but in how different projects create a change to this accessibility score, because we want to be measuring that change. So we measure the accessibility both with and without the project for each of those. Second, it's important here that we average that accessibility across the population. So we can measure it for each census tract, for example, or census block, but really we care about who's living there. You've probably seen maps like this of accessibility scores, and they make very compelling visuals. But what matters here is if you're serving an area improving accessibility where no one lives, that's maybe not the best option. You care about the effect it has on people. So this is actually a change from how it was done in previous rounds, and we want to convert from a place-based accessibility to projects that serve people. Third, we apply an elasticity to convert from accessibility to the change in labor productivity. So this is a method that's used in economic appraisals in a number of countries, and it's usually referred to as wider economic benefits. And so the idea and the theory behind it is that if I can choose from a broader set or more diverse set of jobs, maybe I'll find one that better matches my skill set, and I can be more productive and contribute more economically. It works in the reverse way. Companies and businesses that can draw from a larger labor pool will be more economically productive. And there's some nuance to that, but if you want to keep it simple, which we did in this instance, you can look at the research, and the research shows, well, on average, a 1% increase in accessibility would lead to about 0.04% more labor force productivity. So this gives us a way to convert from the access measure into dollars, and the dollars are nice because we can put it in consistent metrics with some of the other categories and some of the other scores. And then number 4 here, we want to weight the total change both for the total population and for the population that's living in poverty. Now, the risk here is if we look purely at the economic metrics and we want to increase productivity, the people who are more productive to start with are the higher wage earners. And so if you're starting from a higher baseline, that would tend to favor projects that serve high-income areas and high-income people. And that actually works a little bit counter to the equity goals that are being presented here. So we did 2 things to mitigate this effect. Number 1 is we assumed, for the purpose of developing the score, that everyone is starting from the same baseline level, same average level of productivity. And then second, we provide the opportunity to combine the total score and the score specifically added up for people who are living in poverty. And we just add the 2. So it's a weighted average, if you will. And how you weight those 2 or how you combine those 2 is purely a policy choice. There's not anything empirical about it. It's the goals that you're trying to serve. So implications here, I'm going to leave you with 3 based on how we did this and what we learned from this process. First of all, accessibility converted into an economic metric is a pretty simple way to capture this. You can add a lot more from a research perspective, a lot more bells and whistles, a lot more nuance as far as which industries are affected and so forth. But as far as engaging the policymakers, engaging the staff in something that I think does a pretty good job and is something that they can explain and get behind, this was fairly effective. Second, I want to emphasize that any sort of project scoring and selection, we really want to be counting the expected improvement, not the base condition. So identifying something that's a problem that's either a low-income area or maybe it has a high traffic congestion or something, that's fine, but really you want the projects that make an improvement, so you need to evaluate that change. Second, we want to serve people, not places. So again, it's important not to focus on where the project is, but who it serves and how it helps people. This actually was really interesting because it helped diffuse. There was a lot of concern as we went through this, worked with our advisory group, which scores are going to affect rural areas, which ones are going to favor urban areas, and some division there. But by putting the focus on, well, we want to serve these populations regardless of where they live, it actually helped diffuse some of those tensions, if you will, some of that argument, and because everyone was in agreement with those broader goals. And then third, I think we need to be careful and think about explicitly waiting for equity as we go about this. If we're not and we're purely counting the economic total, we risk doing things that increase that disparity, if you will. And I think this goes back to the introduction. It's the difference between those first 2 categories that you had presented, Hank, to start with. And then I'm going to leave with a little bit of a limitation. This is, in this round of things, we've done this for road projects. What we've not done, so we've scored it based on access to jobs by car. What we've not done is done it by any other modes at this point. So I think there's some more thought needed in terms of how can we combine in a sensible way across modes. It's not as simple as just adding them up. So what is the right way? If I can get to, as presented earlier, this many jobs by car, what is the economic benefit of also being able to get to jobs by another mode? It's not obvious, and it's not obvious how we can incorporate that in a practical sense into this scoring. So there's some more thought that needs to go into this in order to advance those goals. And thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Greg. Yes, yes, excellent. And the last issue you brought forward is actually how to define accessibility in such a way that it takes care of different modes, different differences, different times of travel. And can you improve accessibility by improving traffic and transport, or should you bring together jobs and where people live? Thank you. The last speaker will be George, and George will talk about policy making and cost-benefit analysis in Athens. You have the floor, George.
Thank you very much, Thank you very much. We're going to present a nice case about CBA for policies. So far, we have been working a lot on social CBA for specific interventions and measures, but this time we go for a step further, implementing CBA for really policies, which is quite a challenge. In fact, everything starts with the need for prioritizing urban mobility and safety interventions, and of course, we see that resources are not there forever, so we have to make priorities, we have to put what is the most beneficial in front. We are seeking for best value for money, and on that purpose, CBA, it is a fundamental tool. In the European context, we have serious issues about sustainability. We have traffic congestion. We have fatalities, performing well, but still a lot of lives to still save. And of course, emissions is a great challenge. Athens is a very nice city. However, public transport is stagnating. Fatalities, especially of VRUs and serious injuries, are there. So there is need for action, and several solutions are considered. Within this framework, we have to highlight that, of course, we have the financial CBA, the traditional methodology to assess the investment profitability and plan the cash flows, with analyzing the investment costs, the operating costs and the revenues, the source of financing, and reaching the financial net present value and rate of return. Whereas in the social CBA, in fact, we are focusing, of course, in the investment in the course, but also in the social benefits in terms of travel time, vehicle operating costs, road casualties, and of course, noise emissions, air pollution, etc. So, of course, we have to use the social discount rate, which reflects the long-term opportunity cost of resources to society as a whole. And we are using the equivalent economic internal rate of return and economic net present value. So the objective of our work, which we are developing since already several years, already 10 years we are working on all of this in order to quantify and measure and quantify both investments and benefits. And these four urban mobility and safety policies for the city of Athens refer to the 30 kilometers per hour speed limit across the city, the congestion charging scheme, ride-sharing services, and telematics insurance schemes. There is a common methodology followed in all four cases. We start with stated preference surveys in order to determine public acceptance. Then we estimate investment and operational costs and the road user surplus, including travel time and vehicle operating costs, fuel consumption and service, but also externalities, fatalities, air pollution, etc. We monetize everything in terms of cost and benefit for each scenario, and we calculate the internal rate of return and the net present value with the corresponding sensitivity analysis for the different assumptions and the different critical parameters. The four mobility and safety policies refer, first of all, to going from 50 kilometers per hour speed limit to 30 kilometers per hour. This is a big campaign that we are also working on at our university. The congestion charging scheme for a large area with an annual subscription for daily access of passenger cars in the city center, varying across the various vehicle Euro classes, so it is environmental related. The ride-sharing services, fee-based services, and the telematics use in insurance, where we monitor behavior and improve driver behavior through feedback and gamification. So the results demonstrate a very high net present value, economic net present value, and economic rate of return for all four policies. Of course, there is a strong component of road fatalities as fundamentally, and in terms of equity, if you want, the human life is the most important to save. So working on these policies, taking into account the safety benefit, increases considerably the net present value and the economic rate of return. And just to mention that the area is not necessarily, and the time is not fully compatible, so we don't compare these ERRs. There are four independent examples, still demonstrating the high profitability for the society. So we see that for introducing the 30 kilometers per hour in only 10 years, we can save 130 million euros. The introduction of ride sharing can reduce significantly CO2 emissions and save up to 48 million liters of fuel within a decade. For the congestion charging scheme, we see that we can save almost 1,000 lives and reduce emissions by 162 million CO2 tons. And in telematics insurance support, we can lead to decrease road fatalities by 237 in the respective fuel consumption and emissions. Of course, there are limitations. The assumptions can vary, so on that purpose, we defined a set of sensitivity scenario. Still, the rates are very high. Of course, there are some intangible benefits like quality of life or cultural heritage preservation, which are not currently included, and we are trying to include them, but it is a very great challenge to have concrete figures on this. Monetized. Stated preference, we know that there is a great sensitivity. It's different when we state our intentions and indifferent when we accept a measure. We see it also in the, on several different occasions, not only transport. And of course, there are unintended consequences or trade-offs that may arise by changing behaviors and circumstances, so which we have to take into account, and we have taken into account in the sensitivity analysis. So, in conclusion, policy implications, social CBA is a new tool that we should dare using to support our policies because it takes into account externalities and it is more fair overall for the development of the city as a whole. The analysis demonstrated that there is significant positive impact on social welfare in Athens, and one could assume that similar analysis in different cities could provide more or less a positive impact. And of course, even in extreme price changes or significant input variables, the ENPV remains positive if we compare with any other CBA of measures, interventions. We know that the figures presented here are quite high, demonstrated the high usefulness. Then, this is our great challenge in order to convince the society, citizens, politicians, the industry. We have to put in these results of, first of all, carry out CBA, economic CBA analysis, and then certainly to demonstrate this openly to the society in order to gain support and momentum and for the acceptability of these changes, because certainly there is always inertia and skepticism in the beginning. As future directions, we have to certainly improve data collection to be sure about the figures, to guarantee scientific expertise in the analysis because there is a lot of sensitivity in the field. Make social CBA a prerequisite could be a nice idea for authorities, for every decision, and even one could say that we could have social CBA also for doing nothing, demonstrating what we lose when we do nothing. And of course, on that purpose, we need cooperation between industry, authorities, the society to gain the momentum. So thank you very much.
I have a question to the two guys, and maybe you also want to say something about it, because Greg, you said like the big advantage of your criterion was that it's simple and that policymakers can work with it and that they understand it and that they can defend it. And I think, George, you kind of implied that this is maybe not quite the case for your analysis. But you also mentioned many other aspects that should be taken into account. So in the end, are you arriving at something like George's model if you extend your framework, or do you just keep it to the economic indicator? And so I would like to hear your opinion about it, but also George's.
Okay, so I think that's a great point of tension, if you will, and one that I struggle with quite a bit in terms of how complicated to make it or not make it. A little bit of context in this particular project. For a subset of these projects, actually, some of the history is the larger projects we had and still do evaluate using an economic model called TREDIS, which includes the same sort of foundation, but many more sort of wrinkles in terms of the things that it considers. And the staff were pretty down on that, actually, because they said it spits out a number and we have no idea like which type of project we can put in and get a good number and which type of project we can put in and get a bad number. And so that was really sort of a little bit being responsive to that history is kind of where we were approaching this from. And we've done on the side a little bit of evaluation of, okay, if you do it this way and you do it this way, do you get the same answer or not? And I think that's an interesting research question, but there's also we have to wrap this up because it's actually being implemented now and they're going through the next round of project scoring, so at some point, call it off here. Now, in terms of the other aspects to it, I showed you 5 categories. This was one of them. There's something similar in those other categories that is looking at how do you measure and do those metrics. I think there's a couple of things that are missing from those categories. One is we don't have environment as one of the categories. One is we don't have equity explicitly as one of the categories. And so if I were looking at there, that's a thing, but we're sort of, this is sort of at the policy level, it says, consider these 5 categories and figure out how to measure those. But I'll let George comment as well on the question of complexity and simplicity and the tension there.
Yeah, listen, economic CBA is focusing on the treasurers and the bankers to convince them whether we can spend this, we can make these investments. The social CBA, it is mainly for the people and the politicians to convince them for the policies and the measures. However, at the end of the day, the bosses of both are the top politicians and the society. So we need both. They have to be viable, but they have to be also positive for the society. So there are similar facets, necessary both necessary. Of course, it's not perfect because we cannot account for quality of life as such in all aspects, and especially we cannot account for the future opportunities of development and the improvement of the society. This is parts of this are included in safety, in environment, in efficiency. So it is ongoing, and so much work demonstrates that it is useful, and it is much more useful than without. We have to be serious when we spend public budgets, and we have to be serious on the benefits. And this is fundamental in both cases, that we have to take into account really with quantitative methods and financial methods, the costs and benefits. So the problem is that it is not widespread, and we have to further promote it.
Thank you. Any other questions, perhaps?
Great, thank you.
Oh yeah, of course, please.
My name is Joanne Vincent, and I'm with UNICEF out of headquarters in New York, and I'm the global focal point for child injury prevention, which includes road safety. I want to first, again, echo the comments and thank you to all the speakers. Excellent presentations. I have, if it's allowed, 2 questions, one specifically for Professor Yanis, and then I have a question for all the panelists. Thank you, Professor Yanis, for the indicators that you've put in, and there was also a mention that maybe other indicators should be included in some of these cost-benefit analysis, and that's environment, but also some of the other social benefits of that was being talked about, walkability. So, and how do we look at the physical benefits and the mental health benefits of being able to walk to school or walk to work and some of these other things. So are there considerations for other indicators that are being included in the cost benefits analysis would be my question to you. And then the question to all of you is that I think it's been excellent. You've been sharing information about indicators and building a case for financial institutions, but also policymakers to take up these measures. But have any of you already started to implement? Do you have case examples that are underway? Because when we're trying to for us as a UN organization, when we're working with governments, we can give these indicators and these economic factors, but people want to see examples of how it's been used and demonstrate that those estimates really do come out in the end. So it would be great to hear what work you have underway, showing good case examples that we can take forward to other communities and decision makers to put these kinds of measures in place. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I propose George first and then along the line.
Excellent remarks. First of all, fully agree. So the answer to the first question is yes. We need more to take into account equity, to take into account walkability, health issues, of course, because walking more and cycling more, it is much healthier, and there is a big financial benefit for the society with better health. However, we need scientific multidisciplinarity. We are working on this. Today, we presented our transport part. It is, however, still a big challenge. Because there are different ways of monetizing health and transport benefits. So promise it will come soon. And you are fully right, and we agree. And it's a question also of our resources to put it in, and also to the society to convince that there is such a need. The second issue you raised concerning the...
Yeah, next steps. Cases.
Yes, there are several examples. I can tell you that the European Commission wrote a research framework, Horizon, has a project, a big program on mission cities where they monitor implementation of all these innovative new approaches. And it is focusing on implementation and monitoring. So there are a lot of results. I can tell you already the telematics are, incentives are already there in Italy for a decade. In Greece, they are just introduced. So we see that our work on economic CBA is taken into account more and more. But most important is to follow up afterwards, to see and to compare how we performed. And this is ongoing. It works.
Tony? Specific cases?
Thank you for your question. So at GIZ, we did have some projects which encouraged cycling and walking for women in Kerala, in the south of India. So that has helped them, with regards to the access to opportunities. But with regards to your question regarding if metrics have been used, there hasn't been yet. So I think that will be my answer to that. Yeah.
Joanne, that's a really nice question, I suppose. Now, with respect to India, we had already come up with the comprehensive mobility planning guideline, but that was adopted in 2014. At that time, we came up with 36 set of indicators that should be measured by the cities, standardizing the data format. However, because there was lack of interventions by the national government and pressing cities to develop these comprehensive mobility plans, it was not taken up so well. So there is a challenge over there. Second, most of these indicators are very much data intensive. And again, we don't have secondary data sources to support a lot of the analysis. So there's a lot of, we can say, pull and push factor, wherein based on project to project, we are actually coming up with these indicators, measuring them for the cities, communicating with the cities, because the cities are very much part of the project towards implementation. But yeah, at the national level, I would still say that there is a gap over there. So it has to be taken up at the policy level so that these indicators are actually measured.
I think there's clear examples of implementation. Virginia DOT, for example, has done something similar. They've gotten a lot of good attention and press out of that. And I think you learn a lot from the implementation because there's always a, hey, here's a project and I didn't think about this wrinkle when someone wants to do this. So absolutely.
Thank you. The next question for Philippe.
Yes, Philippe Chris with the International Transport Forum.
I have to say that after these presentations, I feel terribly frustrated, and I want to check and see if you feel and share that frustration. Not because of the quality of the presentations, because they're all really good, but because there's an underlying issue maybe that is still lacking in the way in which we address transport accessibility. And that is that I kind of sense that we're looking at wagging the tail, wagging the dog here, because we're talking about how to make transport function more effectively. But there are a lot of other inequitable issues in society, including the housing market, including the real estate, including land value, including land markets, including the distribution of amenities, but necessities as well. And all these have to be accounted for before we start also thinking about how do we move between those issues, those opportunities that are available to us. So my question to you is, how do we move beyond just thinking about transport accessibility into a more accessible, in this case, urban setting, a more equitable urban setting? And to go back to that picture at the beginning, how do we remove the wall, not just think about putting up the different boxes on which people can stand? And I have a very specific methodological question, because a lot of the work on accessibility that we've discussed here is about accessibility, or functions largely, or focuses a lot on accessibility to jobs. But that's not accessibility to work, because there's a huge amount of unpaid work, of care work in society, for which the trips are going to be slightly different. And so when we have an accessibility metric that focuses on jobs, how do we capture that invisible work? And that, unfortunately, is something that is often the domain of women in society. And so how do we capture that in accessibility as well?
I'll take the last question first. So in this, because that's the most you remember clearly. So in this particular measure, when we were looking at this walk-to-work accessibility, we were not measuring jobs as in, so I didn't show you that part of the slides, where we are not measuring jobs as reported by the census or by the authorities. We actually used travel surveys to determine how many opportunities are there in each. So that is basically the number of work trips made in each of the zones. So it accounts for both the informal and the formal sector employment, and therefore addresses the data gap over there. And yeah, the frustrations are really high, because even after pushing the agenda for so long around walkable infrastructure, but we do see that is not still a case in terms of implementation in Indian cities. And that means a lot of things need to be done. Now, coming back to utilitarian and the complex term, egalitarianism. So one is we are talking about this 15 minutes accessible cities, but there is a lot of discussion around, is it going to result in social separation and exclusion? So the areas, for example, transit-oriented development as a policy in India. So there is a lot of thrust on mixing the land use functions, bringing opportunities and demand together, but that is also resulting in rising property values. So is it going to push the demand, or the demand by the low-income groups in the outer periphery of the cities, where the cost of living is going to be less? And it's a big challenge over there. So there is something that we need to continuously monitor. And again, like I said, that the data gaps are there to be able to continuously monitor. But if I recall from one of our pre-session discussions, we can look at big data sources towards continuous monitoring and creating city observatories that can help monitor the changes in the patterns, the demand, and the impact of different projects on walkability.
I comment briefly on the first question, and that was, I think you were asking about, well, this is a focus on transportation, but accessibility is broader than that. And I agree with that. I mean, and I think the nice thing about accessibility is it frames the problem in a way that I can fix it by improving transportation, or I can fix it by moving where the houses are, or where the jobs are, or where the building is. And so I think it's a nice opportunity to do that. I think the way we're using it within transportation, I think you're correct that it's limited. And that's for sort of the reason that I'm working for the Transportation Cabinet. They say our job is to build transportation. Our job is not to dictate land use. That's a different thing. And so when we do our evaluations, we hold the land use constant. And I do think that that's a missed opportunity, because there may be many cases where it makes more sense to spend the same dollars building houses in a place than somewhere else. You've seen sort of these proposals that was somewhat panned, but I think unjustly in a way of, well, what if you were to expand Manhattan and build X many extra homes on Manhattan with landfill? Well, maybe that's a better investment than building more tunnels over into New Jersey. And I think there's a case for that. But I think the challenge is institutional and sort of whose job is it and whose responsibility is it, and how do we sort of broach that gap more so than it is technical. And I welcome input on how we do that right.
A quick remark. Excellent remark. And we have a lot of contradictions when we implement policies. And a blatant example is speeding and safety. We want to go safe and fast. This is impossible unless we take public transport, which can be fast and safe. And this is the fundamental example that the common denominator for having win-win policies is to move from individual transport to public transport, where we can go fast and safe, and also with in an equitable and with high accessibility. The thing is that the public investment there, both in terms of infrastructure, buses and systems, and priority, is very difficult to implement. That's the reason we need to quantify the benefits in order to convince that the model of individual traveling is not having a future. The future is public transport and active traveling. And we have to demonstrate it as best as possible with figures, budgets, and strong communication policies.
Would you like to add? Or? Okay. If I may, I would like to add as well. In the Netherlands, it's common use that, for example, the Department of Health decides what is the most efficient way to have their hospitals organized. For example, different departments concentrated in one and other departments concentrated in another hospital. Which, of course, from the hospital point of view or from the health point of view, is more efficient. The same thing happens with universities. They're also organizing different faculties, only some faculties, so mathematics and physics, only in 2 or 3 universities, and other faculties in other universities, and so on. They're making their business more efficient. And then there's the Department of Infrastructure that used to say, okay, there's more travel, we need to build more roads. So they don't plan, they didn't plan, they just calculated the expected travel time and delay time and built more roads to decrease the delay time due to congestion. And this is changing these days in the Netherlands. So we decide that you cannot be the last department to decide what to do because all other departments have optimized their business. So in the Netherlands, the Department of Infrastructure and Traffic and Transport thinks about what do we want, where do we want the traffic? And that means that in the end, you need to go talk to the Ministry of Health and to the Ministry of Education and say, listen, if you are closing a hospital because it's not efficient to have it there, it means there's a lot of extra traffic, and we have to facilitate that. We're not going to do that. You'll have to pay for it. Well, now I'm thinking a bit ahead because this discussion has not taken place yet. But we are thinking about this. It's not logical that the Department of Infrastructure and Traffic and Transport comes last always and has to facilitate extra and extra car transport. So things are going to change. I think this is interesting. Any other questions? Steve?
Yeah, there's a question to you, Henk, that was very much the story in the Netherlands 20 years ago, and I think you achieved it, but then politicians started to override the Department of Infrastructure and say, yeah, my hospital's going to be there or my new shopping development is going to be there anyway, even though you say it's not going to be there. So there's a political power involved as well. So have you really advanced, or are you just always about to advance? But then I also had a question for India, that both speakers from India. Where do you see, I mean, both of you said the answer is to have better public transport and improved regulation of the semi-regulated smaller vehicles providing shared public transport. So how's that going to happen? Does it have to be the state or the city government that spends more money on buying more buses and starts to do its job in regulating the informal sector and making sure that they do stick to routes, they don't overload, they have a fixed fare and so on? Or is it going to be some private innovators that come in and start offering minibuses with an app that allows you to pay a bit more to have a better service? How do we get to better public transport?
So first we have to understand what is the transport landscape in terms of the public transport system in India. So other than the large size cities, for example, Kolkata, Delhi, which are millennium cities, other than that, if we start looking at the medium-sized towns and smaller cities, their majority of the long distance trips, which are still rare, are being catered by the informal paratransit, the chakras, or the shared autos. So first is, we have to consider the different transport layers that can be built within the city. So one is, obviously, you need walking infrastructure so that everybody gets safe access to between locations. Then second layer is where we start looking at the paratransit, because the kind of travel demand that we have in Indian city is really not like, people are traveling very long distances. They can be easily catered by the smaller vehicles, and which are happening because of the market demand in itself. Now, do we need to regularize it? Will it have a negative impact on the users? Because it shall result in increasing the cost of the vehicles in the operation, and therefore the fares. So that is something that needs to be left for further discussion. But yeah, that is the second layer, because these small vehicles operate throughout the city on every road network. And shared auto rickshaws, based on the demand, the local fleet managers, they actually identify the routes on which these shared auto rickshaws are going to ply, therefore providing cheaper services to the people. Now, this has two benefits. One, it retains the users over there. Second, the travel demand really does not increases because the distances traveled by them are shorter. So, and then when we start looking at this 500 meters, accessibility to public transport system, then you can actually achieve 80 to 100% accessibility by such kind of a system. Then third is where we start looking at the major routes, the arterial roads, where the bus systems are going to be there. And these bus systems are the ones which will cater to the long distance trips, which are formally operated by the city operators. So that is the third landscape. And then only we can talk about the very large size infrastructure investments. So who is going to invest most? I think the answer is well there in the question and my answer so far, because it's going to be both the private and the public, where the public operators mostly look at the larger infrastructure investments, but private operators can operate these smaller fleets, providing more efficient services. I hope that answers your question.
Well, how do you make them invest, both private and public? The problem is that there's underinvestment.
I would say not from the private side and public side also, because we are seeing a lot of development that is happening in the Indian cities with respect to the public transport infrastructure. Only the problem that lies over there is the choice of kind of public transport infrastructure that is needed. So sometimes we see that there is a 10 kilometers route of BRT that is being developed, 15 kilometers of metro rail network being developed. Is that sufficient enough for a city to serve the demand? Because that is going to operate on certain routes only. So there is a need to optimize and identify what is best fit solution for the city rather than. So it's not an issue about the investment, but it's about where we invest and what kind of investments we would want to make.
Thank you. I think Joshua likes the floor. There's a last question over there.
Yeah. Thank you. My name is Kalpana Vishwanath. I'm from India, from an organization, Safety Pin. I had three very quick questions. comments. One is, I think when we talk about equitable transport systems, the focus must go beyond the formal. And I think a lot of people are now saying that instead of referring to the other system as informal, to call it popular transport, because actually that is what the majority of people use. And they use it because the formal transport is not reaching. It doesn't reach the peripheries. It certainly reaches, it's much more in the center of the city. So I think if we cannot speak of equitable if we only measure the formal transport system, number one. Number two, I think the point that was made earlier about the work of CARE and others, again, measuring only work trips or even employment misses out an entire set of this thing. It is partly gender, but it is beyond gender, of people who move the whole day but may not be moving for paid employment or work. And I think that's the second thing. And the third point, to push what was said earlier, absolutely, the government functions in silos. But I think that's all the more reason that researchers need to push that boundary and say, it's not okay anymore to do this. There are very big equity problems and climate and carbon emissions that you cannot function in business as usual anymore, whether it's the transport department, whether it's the infrastructure department. Thank you.
Thank you for these very keen remarks. Is there time for a response? George really wants to.
A very quick. We have to admit that researchers are not doing good communication, and we have to address this. The European Commission has set 3 criteria: excellence, impact, implementation. Researchers stick on excellence, a little bit on implementation, but very low on impact. We have to transform ourselves as researchers, because this is a research session, that we have to go for the last mile, and it's not a last mile, it might be a last marathon, that we have to promote all the time with our research findings, policy making. We forget, and this is not good. We have to change our mind to go also for this communication. This is what I'm doing anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, George. Thank you, George. Ladies and gentlemen, when we started, there were not so many people like now because there was a queue outside. And so the question I would like to start with, I didn't ask. I'd like to ask it now. Whom of you are policymakers and whom of you are researchers? Just to have an idea about who is here. Who of you are consider themselves more policymaker than researcher? 1, 2, 3, 4, what, 5? Good. It's not nothing. And the others are researchers. Or other people who are, the others are all researchers, yes? Yeah. There are. And what are you, sir? What is your profession? You're not a researcher? Yes. You are a researcher, yeah. Oh, so all of you are researchers. Yeah, okay. Good to know. Thank you very much for coming to this first research and policy interaction day meeting this year. I think we are making progress by zipping policy making and research, and hope to see you in other research and policy meetings. And not to forget, tomorrow at 9 in CL2, where we are again talking about accessibility and moving forward in this subject. Thank you very much.